Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Barry Halverson. I'm with the Lake Lawrence Lake Management District, and I'm here tonight with our contractor representatives, project managers, Tim Clark, goes by the name of Clark, and Nikki. They were out with me all day today, surveying the lake and surveying the area around the lake. And with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to Clark so that he can give you the presentation that you all picked up at the back table. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Barry.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. All right, thank you so much. It's really great to be here. First, I want to start off with a big thank you to Barry and Frank for giving us the whole tour today. It was really incredible just in terms of the sites and also the history and context around the lake. And that's something that I really want to bring forward up front, is that Nikki and myself, we are reading reports and we are looking at data and plots, but we're not living on the lake. So your lived experience is a lot more comprehensive than what we have. And so I want to hear those stories from you. I want to hear your experiences, because that information is much more comprehensive than what we will be able to accomplish during our part of the scientific study. I also want to thank Chris Manning, Mr. Carpenter, and Walt Olson for letting us on their property and for those exploration. Very appreciative, especially those little tours that we were provided as well. And your dogs are fantastic. Yeah, we'll be back. I have the slide deck in front of you. I'll be walking through it. And just to start over, to provide an overview for the agenda, we're going to be talking through the development of the Lake and Watershed Monitoring Plan, where we're going to be collecting robust data to inform the Lake Cyanobacteria Management Plan, which is the document that will be used to implement actions to restore and preserve the water quality of Lake Lawrence. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the schedule, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussions. I know that this is scheduled out for 2 hours. I don't expect my presentation or talk to take more than 30 minutes. And so hopefully we won't have to be here till 8:30. So if you want to flip to your next page, I want to start out with our goal for this Lake Cyanobacteria Management Plan. We want to develop a comprehensive science-based plan that will guide public and private investments for the benefit of human recreation and environmental health within Lake Lawrence. More specifically, the objectives of this plan are to develop management goals for that plan. What are we trying to achieve for Lake Lawrence in terms of improving water quality and reducing the amount of cyanobacteria blooms? We want to have specific measurable goals to achieve. We want to first also evaluate the current conditions and the causes of the impaired human and ecological uses, and that's part of this scientific study that I'll be talking about. And then we want to identify the actions, which include both projects, capital projects like stormwater treatment facilities or an oxygenation system that goes installed in the bottom of the lake, to policies, things that can be done at a more programmatic level in terms of land use planning. That would be something for Thurston County to be implementing, that will help us achieve those management goals that we've identified. Moving on to the next page, I want to iterate that this plan focuses on surface water quality. It does not focus on fisheries, aquatic plants, drinking or groundwater quality, or flooding. That doesn't mean we're not going to think about those. We want to consider the co-benefits or consequences of the management actions that we are developing and evaluating for those outcomes. We certainly don't want to recommend something that's going to cause flooding of people's properties or that would impact drinking water quality for the community. So we're going to look for co-benefits, but really the lens that we're putting on is thinking about water quality and more specifically algae management. So which is on that next picture. We have some pretty nasty scums of algae can show up on Lake Lawrence. These are taken from a Como news story from a bloom that was in, I believe, in June of 2018. And so one of the things I want to take a pause here in the development here, and as I talked about at the start, was how important your lived experience of this lake is I want to hear from you. And I know we're here to talk about a problem, we're here to talk about the cyanobacteria blooms, but I really want to hear from you about what are the things you really like about Lake Lawrence? Like, what are the things that we value about this lake? And so the way I want to approach that is first for you to have a moment to reflect on that question, probably about 30 seconds. And then after that, I want to go around the room. I think we have a small enough group that I would like to hear from each person or each pair. So I'd like to go around the room now and just hear a little bit of what you talked about what is special about Lake Lawrence and why you value living here.
Frank Hudick, Pleasant Beach Drive. Great neighbors. I couldn't ask for better neighbors, and we all care about the lake. Some of us live directly on the lakefront, some don't, but we all use it. Recreational boating's great. We got a public boat launch, which is right down the street from us, about a mile away. And I think for the most part, proactive citizen participation on topics of lake stewardship. And I think that's getting better with time, mostly because of Barry.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bob Southard, across the street from Frank. Been here about 2 years, a little over 2.5 years, and got a boat this year, so a pontoon boat. So I'm enjoying the lake and I'm enjoying the water, and it's really, really nice to have and to live across the street and have such great neighbors also. Thank you.
Janice and Randy Leitsky. We've only been here about a year, and the sense of community here has been really awesome. And then seeing the lake, Mount Rainier, and eagles flying overhead is awesome.
And she finally got me out on a kayak.
John Carpenter, and I live right over here, real close, and can see all the activities going on the lake, and immensely enjoy everybody enjoying themselves. And plus, I have grandkids, and we go out on the kayak and enjoy things and see that was quite a thing. But anyway, yeah, I enjoy this lake quite a bit.
Okay, I'm John Carpenter. I live straight across from here on the lake, and for me, this is, there are lots of neat people here, but when people come to visit, they're ready to party, and that's what we like, and my family's liked for many, many years. They owned the property about 53 years, and I moved out here in 1980, so I've seen a lot of change. When we first moved here, there were only 4 or 5 permanent residents, and of course now, what are there, 300 or something? But it's still a wonderful place, and they're pretty friendly people, and that's what I like about it.
Dwight Bishop, been on the lake 20 years over on Pleasant Beach Drive. First, I've got great neighbors on either side of me, and then just the recreational opportunities and the community on the lake. It's has that great atmosphere. We're far enough away from everything else so far, so.
Yeah, I'm Greg Halsey. I've been out here 48 years, have a lot. Lake Point Drive came out, the reason I was here to water ski when I was young, bring the kids out, teach them how to water ski, and we did it, and I water skied through 72, and now I'm too old, so I don't do it. The main reason, and the lake was always smooth, you got glass water, and it was really a nice lake, and I love it. Now I have a pontoon boat, of course. And water cut.
Donna and Steve Brown, we're neighbors. Yeah. I think our main purpose on the lake, we love the lake too, and we love everything about it, but it's mainly family time, so recreational boating, swimming, and all the wildlife that's here, and certainly want to make sure that anything we do going forward encompasses all those things for the health of the water, so anything we do to make the lake greater is good with us.
Good with us, yep.
Michelle and Paul Fossum. We are on Lake Point. We've been out here since '07. We bought property in '07. And our two priorities, or things we enjoy the most, are the wildlife on the lake, the birds, the deer, the fish, enjoying all that, and recreation and boating and making memories with our children on the water.
I'm Tim Kelly. I've lived here for 4 years now. I'm currently the caretaker of the Lake Lawrence community property. I really enjoyed it with the lake. I've lived on a lake before. I lived on a lake up north in Covington. Lived on a lake up in Alaska. Always beautiful, always lots of wildlife. And what I really appreciated here is the effort that goes into preserving the lake and doing what's necessary to maintain the quality of the lake water. This doesn't have a lot of water running into it, not a lot of running out of it. It's just kind of sitting here for a long time, a lot of stuff growing in it. So the effort put forth by the LMD is really impressive. I don't do much. I attend a few of these meetings just to understand what's going on. But when I'm down here working, it's really not a corporate office anymore. It's pretty cool. And what I enjoy about it is not till about noon, but about noon each day, people start coming down here. Kids come down here and they're playing in the water. People are bringing their boats down. People are starting to enjoy the lake, you know, as the day moves on. And the next thing you know, there's people all over the place that are really enjoying the lake. I enjoy watching that. It's really cool to see that many people enjoying our lake.
Terry and Ken Stewart, we're from Wild Air Estates, and I guess my husband's been coming here to the resort for like 62 years, and 57 years ago his parents bought property in Wild Air, started camping there. I've heard tons of stories, and I think we enjoy the wildlife, and you know, there's all kinds of water activity. We love seeing people out on the boats, and we've been remodeling, so we're not taking our kayaks out. But one of the things I've noticed, now my husband, his whole family, this is where they grew up, you know, coming all the time. One of the things I've noticed since we've been here, that we're living here, is everybody that comes over, including his family that hadn't just come and sit, how peaceful it is, how nice, and oh, they see the eagles or, you know, the deer, things like that. It's just peaceful. Everybody says it's peaceful, whether they're sitting down at the dock or just up on the deck. They just can't believe how peaceful it is.
I just enjoy my family's relationship with the lake. It's fun to have the grandkids and great grandkids are starting to come out now, you know, and enjoy the same things we did as kids. So I'd really like to see us be able to continue that with the family.
Thank you all so much for sharing. That sense of community and shared joy and generational sort of sense of place is incredible. I think it resonates in this room, and also when I'm out there, why Lake Lawrence is such a special place. And maybe you know where I'm going to talk about on the other half of this is what's not going so well for Lake Lawrence. What are some of the key problems and issues that are showing up? And I know I talked about this plan focusing primarily on algae and the cyanobacteria blooms that occur. So I'm interested to hear about those and how they're impacting some of those things you love about Lake Lawrence, but also some of the other challenges that are showing up, just so that we can be cognizant of those challenges as we are developing management recommendations for the lake.
They made a nursery and it was really fast for other fish to eat them all up. And now it's like...
Still Frank Udick. I guess if I had to pick a couple top things, it would be certainly the toxic algae. We had an expert in here a year ago, and it's a cumulative effect, which means it builds up in your body. So you worry about your kids, yourself, and your grandkids. Forget about the animals for a second, like dogs and cats, but if it truly is a cumulative effect that builds up in your body, anytime we have toxic algae in the lake, it's of concern. Some of the things we've encountered on the human side is mostly attributed to people that do not live on the lake. Again, we have public boat launch, so trash left around, debris from fishing, including hooks, etc. And most of that occurs on the public boat launch and county park area. But for the most part, it's not as bad as it could be, I guess, so we're fortunate.
Bob Southern, I really don't know a lot about the algae. I know.
I just, Janice and Randy, I just remember when we were trying to buy a lake place, and we did a lot of research, and you look at the Thurston County lake statistics, and this one wasn't rated very high, and it had to do with the algae. And of course it scares you that you can't go into a lake because it's toxic. And when you see neon green streamers on the top of the water, it's scary. And so that's my big concern.
And I just add into it, the level of weeds are frustrating because they inhibit your ability to use the lake.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing, getting the weeds in the prop or whatever you're doing on the lake. And then also, you used to be able to go around the canal all the way around, and it gets so crowded in there that you can't make it around too. So that's a little bit of one of the problems. But yeah, the toxic algae is probably the most concerning. Grandkids can't swim in the lake sometimes, and sometimes you don't want them to, even though there's no warnings out, because you don't know how dirty it is.
Hey, John Carpenter again. You know, it's kind of interesting having been here 50-some years, because when I came, the southern part of that lake this time of year would be completely covered in lily pads. You couldn't take a boat in there. And so we started the process and we started harvesting them. And it's been beautiful, much more beautiful now, but we're starting to get other things growing because we've opened it up or taken things away from it that it doesn't like. So that's a concern, but it's definitely a beautiful lake. I can't say anything bad about that now.
I would just say it's gone through its ebbs and flows. We were just discussing that where 5 to 6 years ago, when we really started seeing a lot of the algae got really bad, it seems like it's gotten a little bit better. It's still there. So, you know, there's a lot of things happening. Lake levels this year, obviously it was a cooler June. So, you know, we've kept a higher lake level. I would say it looks like it's dropped 3 or 4 inches in the last couple days, even though that hot weather. So it overall, I would say the last couple of years it's looked a little bit better, because it looked really bad in 17, 18, 19.
In terms of the lake level or the algae?
Both. Just water quality, that's when it seemed to start really showing up.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I remember when I first came here, we had so many pond weeds. The lake never had many algae blooms. But when I went to the first meeting of this, 38 years ago, and the guy that was from the county says, get rid of the weeds, you're gonna have another issue, and that could certainly be algae blooms. Right out of the get-go, 38 years ago, that's just what can happen. But got rid of the weeds, and not a lot less weeds on the ski rope when you came out skiing. So. But it's still surviving. I think it's fine.
Yeah, I would say the same thing about the weeds. It just, you know, it's a feast or famine. You either, you know, you take out the weeds and then chance of the algae blooms, and you know, but that's the concern really, is about the lake water, about the, you know, the algae blooms for the kids to swim and, you know, and pets be safe.
Paul Fossum. I just echo the room here. Basically, is our biggest concerns the water quality. When we don't want to hesitate to, when the kids get up in the morning and want to go jump in the lake, go. We don't want to have to think twice about that. We have lots of family that fly in from all over the country, all over the world, and we don't know if the lake's going to be usable when they get here. So it's that's the primary concern, at least at the water level. We have some stuff up ground that's a different Thurston problem, but But at the water level, definitely the algae and then the weeds.
And we choose, I mean, selfishly, you know, property value, if we bought, you know, built a home on the lake that we'd love to pass down to the next generation, and we don't know what the property value is gonna look like if the lake becomes more and more unusable, so it's a concern too.
A concern with the lake not being usable at all. You know, like the last property I had was right on the lake, and it was not managed at all. And it became so choked in with lily pads that either ducks, geese, or anything else would come to that lake at all. It's completely covered. So it does here, the activity as far as trying to manage a lake is something I really appreciate. But the best and worst time is when I've got to drive a sign in the ground that says don't go in the lake. You know, it's best to keep people out, and it's worse to see those kids that want to go jump in the lake. Just got to tell them no, don't do it.
So Terry Stewart, and last, I think around April, I took a bunch of pictures of blue-green scum that was all over around our dock, and I'm like everybody else is like, well, are the grandkids or the kids, niece, nephews, are they gonna be able to swim in the lake? As the water started going out, all the weeds and stuff seemed to migrate over our direction. The water pushes it over, and when the water went out last year, it just rotted, and it was like, not only smelled like cow poop, I got in there to try to clean it up because we were having company, and it was like walking through it. It was just, I hadn't seen anything like that before here. So it was, you know, that's it, the water quality for people to go in and swim. Who wants to swim in blue-green water?
Should that closer.
Oh, I got better ones, but this one's all choppy.
All right, thank you all. That's really helpful to hear your concerns, and I've heard a little bit in terms of that balancing act between algae management and aquatic plant management, and that you said feast or famine, and it's very true. And so when we're doing an aquatic plant management, or when we're doing algae management, we also need to keep aquatic plant management on hand. We can't do one or the other. They have to be done in tandem. And so that's one of the things that we know, and Barry has shown a lot of during our tour today, of the amount of plant management that's going on. And with algae management as it's being implemented, there may be a increased need for plant management as well, and taking larger actions. I know there are some barriers in terms of permitting from the county, and those are things that we'll have to have a conversation with the county in terms of how do we do both, and how do we do both well. And so that's going to be what's going to be baked into this plan as we're developing it. So I want to talk a little bit about lake eutrophication, about how we got to where we are today in terms of the presence of algae blooms. You'll notice on this slide saying lake eutrophication, there's just a box that says nutrients. This was an animated slide. Lake eutrophication, eutrophication is the nutrient-induced increase in algae productivity and biomass. So that's due to nutrients, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus, entering a lake and feeding that algae so that it has increased productivity and is growing more and more. The process is sort of moving from that clear water to that murkier water. And in that upper right picture, we have a picture of a more pristine alpine lake, clear water, very low nutrient content. And on the right is a much more eutrophic lake. And it's really a part of a feedback loop, which is what the bottom left would be showing, is that nutrients are feeding into algae, and algae feed zooplankton or water fleas, the daphnia, the little critters, which then feed fish. But when we have too much algae, they end up decomposing, and during that decomposition process, they consume a lot of oxygen. And that happens at the bottom of the lake and in the lake sediments. And because of that consumption of oxygen, and there's no oxygen at that sediment interface, there's actually nutrients that get re-released from the sediments that were locked away in the sediments. So we have phosphorus and nitrogen get re-released from the sediments into the lake, and that feeds algae. So this hyperproductivity of algae is just feeding into itself. It's a positive feedback loop. And that's part of the reasons why we see this eutrophication and algae productivity being worse over years and over decades, is it has this feedback loop that's occurring. So what we want to do is come in and stop that feedback loop. And there's a little schematic on the bottom left with the relationship between nutrient loading and algal biomass. And typically it's sort of a shift from plant dominant to algae dominant, where we have the suspended algae and the rooted plants. Right now, Lake Lawrence is kind of in the middle. It has a dominance of both, and it kind of shifts from year to year. And so what I just talked about, we're gonna have to manage both here, because we have a lot of nutrients, but we also have a lot of plants, and we have a lot of algae. And one of the algae that we're most concerned around is Cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae. They have a lot of competitive advantages over other algae, especially in nutrient-rich waters. They're able to regulate their own buoyancy, meaning they're able to float up and down the water column. So they can move up to the top to get light over other algae. And they can move down to deeper waters where that nutrients are being released. They're also able to take on excess phosphorus and hoard it for later. We call that luxury uptake. Yeah, I always think of like a Rolls Royce that they're riding down to take up their phosphorus. They are also not really preferred food for grazers like those Daphnia or water fleas that I was talking about. They're not really nutritious, they're filamentous, they're not good to eat, they clog their feeding apparati. Some of them are able to fix nitrogen gas. So if there's not enough nitrogen, they can turn nitrogen gas into something that they can use. And then they also have lower energy needs, and so they're able to grow deeper in the water column, near where that phosphorus and nitrogen is, where there's more nutrients. And then, typically, they get to such a high density that they are now fighting each other for light and nutrients, and they'll start moving up in that buoyancy, and that's when they're starting to form those scums, because they have been that buoyancy has kind of gone overwhelmed, and they just have become bubbles, and they are arriving at the surface. But they've been growing throughout the lake surface all that time. But it's when they form those scums that the wind can really push them, and you end up, from my understanding, is really getting those built up along the eastern shoreline. But it can happen at any shoreline, depending on dominant wind patterns. But they are growing throughout the lake. Moving on to the next slide. When it comes to describing lakes, we have three classes to describe the trophic state, which is just the level of algae productivity. Oligotrophic is low levels of productivity. Mesotrophic is in the middle, and eutrophic is that high productivity. And on the plot on the right, we have the trophic state score. This is from the monitoring that's done by Thurston County Environmental Health. Starting in 2009 through 2021, and Lake Lawrence in both basins is solidly eutrophic in that sort of brown tan region. It varies a little bit year to year, but often is pretty stable in what we would classify as eutrophic. We also have some data from 1990 that was done as part of a more comprehensive study, and those values are pretty similar. It'd be great to look at more historic data where that's available, but there's few and far between for that. Then on the next slide below, one of the things that we're really concerned about is when those blooms are causing closures, when we're having exceedances of state recreational guidelines. And we see that there can be between one, sometimes 0 closures in a year, but sometimes up to 5. And that's really what we're trying to avoid, is minimizing that impact to recreation and potential impacts to human health here. The next page. So how did we get here? Why is Lake Lawrence eutrophic at this point? And so put on your reading glasses. This text is pretty small, but I will be doing that as well. So before colonialization, this land was inhabited by the Cowlitz and the Squally. Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla peoples. In 1873 was the first survey of the lake. There were about 25 to 30 settlers who landed in the region. At that time it was called Candle Lake. In the late 19th century, it was renamed to Lake Lawrence, and 2 small sawmills were placed on the lake shoreline. You can see them on this much larger map, which is great. And as was typical at that time, the sawdust and wood waste was just discarded directly into the lake. And I've heard tale of the different slabs that were found and layers of bark dust that can be found in those areas, which I'd love to see some photos of. Then in the early part of the 20th century, in 1908, the lake was actually used as a reservoir for the Tumwater power plant, which just was a diversion from the Deschutes River to fill up the lake, raising it about 20 feet. The outlet was dammed, and then in the fall they would release water to supplement the low flows of the Deschutes River in order to make sure they could run the hydroelectric plant and keep the street trolleys running. But that ended in 1928, but those 20 years are probably one of the more important and influential to the history of Lake Lawrence and why we're seeing conditions as we are today. In the mid and later in the 20th century, 1920s to 1940s, Edwards Resort was a very popular destination. It was a fishing destination. In the 1950s, WWW started doing more active management of the lake and actually looked to remove the bass and perch and spiny fish using rotenone treatments and started stocking with rainbow trout. There was a while that there was co-management of net pens here with DFW in order to raise rainbow trout. My understanding that has ceased, but they are continuing to stock with rainbow trout. And this continues to be a wonderful destination for fishing, as I saw many folks out there today on a Thursday. And then in the 1960s, the shoreline was subdivided and more areas were becoming residential. Lee Edwards dug the canal to make Goat Island, which is a beautiful treat. We saw some deer on it, so it's maybe thinking about renaming it. Barry was telling me about the tremendous amount of work that's being done to manage the invasive plants, especially the Himalayan blackberry on that lake, and it's incredible how much work has to be done to do that, to fight that Himalayan blackberry. And so, like, I'm so impressed by what has been done on Goat Island. And then in the 1990s, due to this continued incidents and concerns around water quality, there was a study done by KCM that ran from 1990 to 1991, and from that they developed a lot of management recommendations. That study was funded by the state. It was a very well-funded study. That was back when the state was putting a lot more money towards lake management and lake management planning. Unfortunately, those management plans were not fully implemented. They were very costly. I'll talk about those in just a second. So that 1990 study was the most recent comprehensive study. We continued monitoring by Thurston County is very informative to look to see how much have conditions changed, at least over the past decade. But that study that was done in 1991 is really a bedrock for what we'll be looking at as we are doing a reevaluation for current conditions and what has changed. So in that study from 1990, they determined that Lake Lawrence was eutrophic and that algae was being dominated by cyanobacteria. That means we weren't seeing green algae or diatoms or other types of algae. It was really still that blue-green algae. They determined that most of the water that enters the lake is through groundwater, subsurface flow, or precipitation directly on the lake. There's a small amount that's through overland flow, but our soils around here, and I was really marveling at the size of the boulders, and I pity whoever has to dig fencing around here, but it's really well draining, so it's just going to go straight into that soil and move subsurface into the lake. There are a few areas of overland flow, which I think maybe were not captured in, and then, so we'll be looking at that. They determined that Lake Lawrence is stratified from April to October and having low oxygen near the lake bottom. Stratified is a phenomenon that happens in lakes as well as oceans, in which we have a thermal gradient between the surface water and bottom water, and because the density of water changes with temperature, the less dense warm water forms its own layer, whereas the colder water at the bottom has its own layer, and these layers don't mix. That's what we call lake stratification. And so that sets up in the summertime, but then as the lake cools into the fall, those temperature equilibrate and the whole lake can mix. But during the summertime, we have this bottom water that's not mixing, and that's where that oxygen consumption is happening from all that decaying plant and algae material.
So is that bad or good?
Well, it's not good. So oxygen is important. Fish needed to breathe. I needed to breathe. Well, I can't breathe underwater, but it's really important. So it's really limiting on that, especially like the trout habitat where they can be. Trout really like colder water, and so they try to go into deeper waters. But they can't go that deep in Lake Lawrence because of how there's not enough oxygen. So they really get stuck in kind of a little band, and we call that the thermal squeeze. Yeah.
So in a percentage, is it 10%, 20%? Where's that level at in relationship to the depth?
Percent of what? Sorry.
The stratification. Where is that level? Is it
how much of the lake is low oxygen?
Stratified and...
Yeah, I don't have that off the top of my head. The lake is fairly shallow, and so there's just a few of those like larger deep holes. So off the top of my head, so don't quote me on this, I would say about 20% of the lake is probably has that anoxic condition in the summertime, and then the overlying 80% is warm and oxygenated.
It's about the bottom 5 to 6 feet of the deep portion.
Bottom 5 to 6 at the deepest point.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we'll be looking at that, and I'll have a better number for you next time we talk. So
do they believe that's happening in both basins?
it should be happening in both basins. The West Basin is deep enough for that to happen as well, and that's what's been observed in Thurston County and was observed in KCM. And so next time we meet, I'll have some better graphics to show what that's looking like in both basins.
We actually do testing, water quality testing that measures oxygen levels, and it shows the thermocline and everything else, and they're done once a month by Thurston County right now, between April and October, and they're going to do that, continue to do that, and do it year round for October to October, I believe.
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Just to wrap up the findings from that 1990 study, they determined that most of the phosphorus, that primary nutrient for algae that's coming into the lake, is coming from the lake itself, coming from the sediments. About 84% of it is coming just from release from the lake's bottom sediments. And then 10% is coming in from groundwater. And then a small portion is coming in from that overland flow. And that there is more release just because of the larger sediment area in the eastern basin.
So in comparing that to other lakes and so forth, is that a high number or a low number?
It's high. It's
so
high.
10%, even though it's only 10%.
Oh, for the groundwater?
Yes.
It really depends on the lake system. For really well draining lakes like this, or well draining soils like this, it can be pretty high just because there's not that much surface flow. I think just because of how much phosphorus is being released from the sediments, that groundwater percentage seems lower. It's still a pretty good amount because there's really not that much overland flow. If we think about Spanaway Lake, which is a lake I've been working on recently up in Pierce County, it has really high loads coming in from its groundwater. I'd say about 40% is groundwater, 40% is internal sediments. Again, these are kind of round, I have a report on it, but approximately they're equal. In the summertime, the sediments are a much larger contributor relatively, but over the course of the year, due to the just well draining sort of river of subsurface flow that's coming into Spanaway Lake, as well as picking up a lot of septic systems, drainage fields. It's bringing a lot of phosphorus. That's not happening here in that same degree, but is certainly something that we will be looking at, because we are first going to be looking at what can we do in terms of managing the sediments in Lake Lawrence, but also thinking about how do we make sure those sediments aren't replenished with phosphorus coming in.
Which, I mean, this is all septic.
Yeah.
Around it, so that's where I was more curious.
Yeah. So we're gonna spend some time looking at that, but I'll talk about that soon. Then, not your septic system, it's everyone else's.
Pipe goes straight to the lake.
And specifically, one of their important findings with the algae, in terms of things that can limit algae growth, there's light, there's nitrogen, there's phosphorus, there's other micronutrients like iron. The study found that phosphorus was the primary limiting factor. That means that if we add more phosphorus, we'd have more algae. If we reduce the amount of phosphorus, we have less algae. So it's really the controlling factor. At some point, if you reduce the phosphorus or increase the level of phosphorus so much, those are probably going to be light limited. And that's what we see in really hyper-eutrophic lakes. I was just out in Ocean Shores, which maybe you've been out to. Really beautiful place, but really troubled lake water. And that algae growth is limited by light because it's so productive that they actually are competing with each other just for light itself. But here, we kind of have mostly just a phosphorus limitation. The next plots are just sort of illustrating what I talked about a little more, kind of showing the kilograms on the x-axis for each of those loads that they calculated. So about over 1,000 kilograms coming in from the internal loading, whereas it's more around 150 for groundwater.
So with that number, based on the volume of the lake, is that 1,000 kilograms a lot?
It's a lot.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a lot. And so one of the things that we see on that bottom picture down below, which is sort of just where we talked about in terms of the inputs, which are the 4 columns on the right, and then we have outputs. Where's that phosphorus going? So there's that internal loading that occurs, which is the 4th column here. That's feeding the algae. The algae then die and fall to the bottom of the lake, and that is called sedimentation. And that's just sort of the loss of algae from the lake. And so these are accumulating. And then that phosphorus is released, as I was talking about, through the anoxia or low oxygen at the sediments, and so that's released. And so that's just cycling through. And what you can see right between them is the outlet, and that's how much export of phosphorus is happening from the lake. How much is getting down and going into the chutes. And it's very minor. So we're really just having this constant loop, and very little is leaving. We're having more that's coming in through groundwater that's leaving through the outlet. So we are kind of a net, always in a net surplus.
Is that what they refer to in some lakes as flushing, when the water is flushed out of the lake on a regular basis through a river or stream or something like that, where a lot of the phosphorus is flushed out of the lake,
yeah,
just as much as it comes in?
So the amount of water that moves to the lake is really important for its level of productivity. How long are the algae going to have to grow there, but also, is that phosphorus going to stay in the water column? Is it going to cycle through, or is it just going to get pushed out? So lakes that have a higher flushing rate have a lot more phosphorus export. They can still be really productive, but oftentimes maybe can be easier to control by focusing on those external loads, whereas in this case, we're really looking at Lake Lawrence within itself.
So based on like his question, so phosphorus, does the phosphorus stay throughout the whole entire column of the lake, or does it pool more at different levels? Does it sit to the bottom? Does it sit to the top, in the middle? Which obviously the flushing effect would be different depending on the level. So is it consistent throughout, or is there?
I suspect not, and so phosphorus will be showing up in the lake in several forms. There'll be the phosphorus that's within algae itself.
Yep.
There's going to be the phosphorus that's just in sort of soil and dirt and suspended particles, leaves. Those can be kind of like throughout the water column. Oftentimes we'll see algae closer to the surface, depending on the type of algae, or maybe at the thermocline, that gradient in between. But then there's also dissolved phosphorus, and this is what's being released out of the sediments. And so we can have a lot higher concentration of that dissolved phosphorus at the bottom of the lake, where the algae maybe can't get down that far, or they can't take it all up, just because of light limitations and their own limitations of like that regulating that buoyancy. And especially in lakes where you have so much phosphorus, you can really have a buildup of that dissolved. But that is leaching up, again, just due to diffusion across that density gradient, but also because the algae are moving down and picking up that dissolved phosphorus and turning it into their own biomass. And then they bring it up, and then they might die, and then that dissolved biomass or dissolved phosphorus might go to another piece of algae, and that cycle, or is just gonna fall to the bottom, but that just starts the cycle all over again. So that's a major issue you're going to have to tackle here. It's just that cycle of phosphorus is really kept within Lake Lawrence. We're not getting any phosphorus out of the lake. Going on to the next slide, those potential phosphorus sources that were identified by KCM, they talked about on-site septic systems. They didn't specifically say that, you know, this was the #1 cause. They said this could be contributing to. So this is not specifically ranked. The concern around that on-site septic systems are that this area is really highly permeable soils, as I talked about, so those septic drain fields are good at managing human waste, but they aren't very good at managing phosphorus, and so they don't really treat phosphorus. They rely on the surrounding soils to attenuate or grab up that phosphorus. It gloms onto the soil, and then is taken up by plants. But in areas where you don't have that much soil between the septic system and the lake, especially if that groundwater is moving quickly, you can end up getting a lot of import to the lake. And so we're going to be looking into that to try to better evaluate what is the relative contribution of septic systems for phosphorus using some modeling. Additionally, legacy farming and logging can be a contributor, just from the inputs from manure, really phosphorus rich, and fertilizers. Those can build up in the soils. I know there's still some ongoing logging to a minor degree and agriculture in the watershed. So those continue to be inputs, but it seems that based off of that phosphorus budget that was done by KCM, we really have a lot in this sort of historic phosphorus reservoir. Additionally, the shoreline runoff, the fertilizers, pesticides can be an important contributor of phosphorus. Barry was telling me that for the most part, nearly everyone on the lake does not use fertilizers and refrains from using pesticides, and really appreciate that. That is really important to help minimize that external import of phosphorus to the lake. And then additionally, those 20 years of the Deschutes river diversion into Lake Lawrence, where it was just being used as a settling pond for a lot of those suspended soils in the Deschutes. The Deschutes has a history of agriculture. It's really rich in phosphorus due to agriculture and upstream logging practices. So that getting diverted for 20 years and contributing to this 20+ feet of sediment at the bottom of Lake Lawrence really helped build up that reservoir of phosphorus. So what they recommended from that plan was to dredge in both basins. This has not been done yet. It's prohibitively expensive. Their initial cost estimate was pretty low, but if we were to look at more recent cost estimates of what dredging is, it's about $250 million if we were to dredge Lake Lawrence. So it's really not feasible to do. It's very expensive to move that amount of earth, to dry it, and just the logistics of it. They recommended harvesting of aquatic plants because those aquatic plants hold on to some phosphorus, so harvesting and removing them from the lake helps reduce that. For managing aquatic plants, they also recommended doing sediment covers and introducing grass harp for plant control, and then reaching out to residents and folks in the watershed to reduce their own fertilizer use and working with Thurston County to implement stormwater management techniques to help reduce the amount of runoff that's getting into the lake. So they did look at other measures such as alum treatment for the lake, but they didn't think it was going to be cost effective in the long term. Compared to dredging, I think their dredging estimates were very low, and I think that there are some additional technologies that we will want to evaluate as part of this that can be more cost effective. We're going to have to spend some time looking at that and running the numbers. That's one of the things we'll be doing as we collect this data. So we are really interested to look to understand what are the current conditions, and that's sort of the next question is what are we going to do? So first up, we're going to do some water quality monitoring in Lake Lawrence. This is in partnership with Thurston County Environmental Health. They'll be doing a lot of the monitoring in the lake, and we will be coming down to do some monitoring around the watershed to help characterize what are the inputs, as well as coming down and do some sediment sampling. So our main questions for this monitoring, this scientific study, are what are the current water quality conditions and plankton dynamics in Lake Lawrence? How do those change over time? Are we seeing lots of cyanobacteria in the deep waters? Are they vertically migrating up and down? Just to understand how is phosphorus moving through, and how are cyanobacteria becoming the dominant species? We're also interested if there have been any changes in the phosphorus budget or the water budget since 1990. We're really interested in sediment release because that was the primary source that they identified, but we're also interested to really evaluate that ditch input, which I don't think they did properly in that 1990 study. So we'll be looking at that, and as well as checking in on that stormwater flows. There certainly has been some changes in development. New land has gone in. There's been land use conversion. So we'll be evaluating how much have things changed. To do so, here's our draft plan for that water quality. We're going to revisit the 1991 monitoring sites, or really close as we can get. We just have their paper maps, and so we'll go out there and think we're in about the right spot. We're going to do monitoring in both basins from October of this year to October of 2025, collecting profiles, looking at temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, and conductance at half-meter intervals, so we can really understand what is the distribution of that temperature, of dissolved oxygen in the lake, and how does that change with seasons? When does that mixing event occur? We'll be looking at the amount of total dissolved phosphorus at the surface of the lake and in the lake bottom. We'll measure chlorophyll A, which is a measure of algae biomass, and we'll identify the types of algae that are present. And we'll also be doing some observations of how many swimmers run the lake, how many ducks, how many geese. I know there's been some work around geese management here, and so I'll be interested in hearing the historic geese counts. Barry was sharing that earlier, and I need to get some of this stuff in writing too. Then we'll be working with that existing monitoring for lake level monitoring that Frank leads up with University of North Carolina, and I think University of Tennessee, and NASA, and NOAA, and just a really great collaboration there so that we can understand how the lake level is changing over time. I know that's a concern as well, and so we'll be looking at what happens during our monitoring period as well as what has happened over time. And then we also will look at how much is coming in from the watershed and how much is leaving. We'll do some discharge measurements going onto Chris's property, getting Luna inside first though, and then we can do the monitoring. And then also in September of this year, we're going to come out and do some sediment sampling, and this is we'll be collecting cores and then evaluating the amount of phosphorus and iron within those cores, and that's going to tell us how much is available to be released during these stratification periods, so we can develop that estimate of internal loading. What is all that monitoring going to tell us? We go to the next page. For those who may be lost, I'm on slide 25 right now. Water quality monitoring plan it's going to tell us, have there been any substantial changes in water quality within the lake or the watershed since that 1990 study? Has that internal phosphorus load changed? It'll help us inform what management methods are likely to be effective in Lake Lawrence, and where should we make further investments. So this is all to develop this lake and watershed plan. The picture here is just a satellite image from August of last year, and you can see Lake Lawrence glowing green in the landscape. So when we're developing our cyanobacteria management plan for Lake Lawrence, we're going to be looking at both near and long-term actions that can manage water quality that are going to be in line with our goals and objectives. And so we want to look at what can be done now to help relieve these issues, to help get people in the water and feeling safe, but also what can be done that will be cost effective over a long period of time to help maintain the good conditions and good water quality of Lake Lawrence. So over the next few slides, I'm just going to go through as a high level some management strategies that we'll be evaluating in terms of the watershed management. We'll certainly want to look at and evaluate the influence of septic systems, and from that we may make recommendations around increased frequency of inspections done by environmental health or by the homeowner looking to do repairs or even replacement of septic systems, or changing where they are placed to get them further away from the lake. There are some really cool technologies out there, which reverse membrane, is it the membrane bioreactor, which helps actually remove bacteria and phosphorus from septic system leachate. It's being piloted over in Spokane County, Lake Newman and Spokane. They're working with their public health department, conservation district, and the state Department of Health. They received grant money to pilot a program to put in these more novel technologies to replace aging septic systems to help reduce the amount of phosphorus that's coming into the lake through the septic systems. So that's something we'll be interested in taking a look at if we think that septic systems are really influential. And certainly they may not be the leading cause, but they're going to be that ongoing source of phosphorus. So ongoing management is going to be a recommendation. It just might not be the top of the list. We also will look at recommendation on pollution reduction actions, doing management around pet waste, fertilizers. There's already a huge amount of communication that's being done by this lake management district to educate folks on that waste management is necessary. You're saying that you're out there every day picking up that pet waste with a shovel. I really appreciate that, and that's coming from the hard work of Barry and others in the Lake Management District to let people know what influence they can have on their lake water quality. So we might not have any specific more recommendations other than to continue what you're already doing, but that's a good thing to know that you're doing the right thing. We also want to look in terms of what are the agricultural and forestry best management practices that can be done to help reduce erosion or manure from running off into the watershed. There is a few agricultural uses in the watershed, and so we'll be looking at what practices could be done in partnership with the conservation district. That certainly is something that is really in their wheelhouse to help implement, and so we'll be talking to the Thurston County Conservation District to help develop recommendations there. Then there's those strategies that are going to be happening in the lake. As I talked about, this is right now we're starting with a really kind of an in-lake problem. So we'll be looking at phosphorus inactivation. This is creating stable chemical bonds with phosphorus using different chemicals, such as alum, which forms a flocculant and pulls algae and other particles from the watershed, and then binds strongly to phosphorus and helps that lock into the sediments and is not able to get released when that low oxygen occurs. Similarly, lanthanum is able to form those strong bonds. It doesn't form the flocculant, so you're not going to get that sort of cleaning that occurs with alum, but it also will form that strong bond and has been used well for that sediment inactivation of phosphorus. We'll look at hypolimnetic oxygenation, which is to introduce oxygen to those deep waters. This can be beneficial for those cold water fish like trout and salmon, but it really depends on what is the extent of those deep waters. And those systems have to have installation, and I talked to Barry about where those may be installed, but also those have ongoing costs associated with them in terms of power in order to run the pumps to put oxygen into the deep waters. So we'll be looking at the cost of both building those systems and what does it cost every year to actually run that. We'll look at options like biomanipulation, things that can be done of adding fish, removing fish in order to try to manipulate the food web in order to give other algae a better competitive advantage. This is really hard to do. There's a lot of uncertainty to it, but we'll look into it to see, is there any new literature, any new studies that's gonna help us try that out. And so it's something we'll look into. We're probably not gonna have any strong recommendations around it, but it'd be, if you want to turn your lake into a laboratory, I think that's something we could do. But I don't think you're interested in that. So then we have lake circulation that helps aerate the lake and also can help fight that natural buoyancy competitive advantage that cyanobacteria have. If the lake is being mixed constantly, they're not able to move up and down, and the other algae are just getting mixed too. So they remove that competitive advantage.
So is that what's going on? When you look at a lake and you see the fountains going in the lake, is that doing that?
Yeah, so they're trying to do that mixing as well as a little bit of aeration. Usually those are really shallow ponds. And so they're trying to do that mixing and keeping it aerated, because usually those are full of duck poop and just a lot of organic material at the bottom. So they're really trying to keep that oxygenated so it helps break down that duck poop. And sometimes, and then often what you don't see is they are going in and putting in algicides to kill that algae. Usually you don't see that, but oftentimes those ponds are managed not just through those aerators. So we'll also look at dilution and flushing. Maybe we'll put the Deschutes back through the lake, see if that's feasible. This is the big list that we're starting with, and we're going to narrow it down. Some of these are not good ideas, and so if you look at it, we already have dredging crossed out. We know that's prohibitively expensive. We don't need to spend more time looking at dredging. There's already been a huge amount of work done for it. It's not something that is economically feasible for this lake.
Just a quick question on that. If we dredge, does that solve the problem, or do you still have to go in and treat afterwards?
I think it would be very effective. I think it's not something that's feasible to do.
And I understand that. I'm just curious though, that if we did dredge it, would that completely solve it? Is that the ultimate cure of our issues?
I suspect it would be effective.
Okay.
It would deepen the lake, provide greater habitat for those cold water fish, and then also remove that reservoir of phosphorus. It's a lot of sediment to remove, which is why it's so expensive. And even if you remove the top 3 meters, there's just more phosphorus rich. So you really have to remove all of it. And that's why it's so expensive, because you're removing a huge amount. And so I think that's why we'd be looking into more different methods in order to trying to cap that and just.
But just to compliment his comment, because I'm strong in favor of this. I think you should at least topically talk about dredging.
We will talk about
pretty much the words you just said, because that's what the previous report said. And truly, that's the optimal solution from everything I've seen. Notwithstanding cost, okay? But that's an independent variable. You guys are the scientists. Tell us the optimal second, third, and not to say that we're not, going to ignore costs. Certainly the government will, but the fact of the matter, if that's the optimal solution, and in fact, that's what we're spending $250 million on in Capitol Lake, why isn't that the solution for our lake? So, I mean, we'll sit there and analyze and go well through the cost figures. I think we should make that statement.
So one of the things that's really important as we were developing this plan, we wanted to be science-based, we also wanted to be implementable, which is very hard to say. And so those larger pie-in-the-sky ideas, we will look at and we'll talk about that and the possible effectiveness, but that political challenge of getting that money together to fund that is
Understand.
yeah. But so we'll talk about it. We'll also talk about what those barriers are. We're going to have a thoughtful plan here, not just listing out what we wish we could do.
So the right political people are not living on our lake, is what you're saying.
I think you would have to have a very important person for $250 million. I'm not. Yeah. But.
So that 250 million, that was in 1990, they came out with 250 million, is that what you're saying?
They had a lower estimate, but there's been more recent work. I think the last one was in 2022. Yeah, so there's been some really recent reevaluations of that to estimate those costs. And so that 250 million is a very recent estimate. That's not coming out of that 1990 report. That's looking at,
I mean, that's just another number they threw out. That's just a number that's been thrown out there.
250 million? I wouldn't say thrown out there. I think there was some rigorous work to develop that estimate.
It was based on the Capitol Lake project, which is the same size, same depth, and the same sediment from the same river that deposits it.
So very similar.
Very similar.
Thank you, Barry.
Yeah. And the 1990-91 study gave an estimate of $5 million, 4.9 million, which was just off the cuff without any really analytical data behind it. And then the 1994-95 dredging study actually put everything together. Mm-hmm. And we had members of the Lake Management District actually do a test for determining if it was possible. They brought a dredge in at the public boat launch. We spent a week dredging material to determine how the sediment could be withdrawn from the lake, how long it would have to be in a centrifuge to flush out the water, etc., and put it back in. That study showed a cost of about $50 million in 1994.
Analyzing our sites, we will develop updated maps, and that'll be part of our QAPP.
But just to follow that line of thought,
yeah.
If the Deschutes River inflow was in fact contributory to a lot of this, it sure seems like we should be monitoring where the Deschutes River dumped into the lake.
Yeah. So we,
here, but
based off our,
yeah, that's not a good idea.
No, based on our requirements today, I do want to do a monitoring station to look at the water quality coming in through that ditch. And then also I want to look into maybe revisiting where some of these sediment sampling sites are to evaluate that southern area. But that, I'm gonna have to do that discussion with my team.
Yeah, you're not gonna get a lot of sediment in that southern area.
It's a lot of rocks.
It's all rocks.
Yeah.
No,
it's a good way to destroy our device.
Yeah. No, you won't get through there. It's rock. What happened is the ditch that ran from the Deschutes River ran down through there.
Yeah.
And it pushed all the sediment out of there into the deeper areas and left the rock bare.
Yeah.
So where exactly was that on the southern basin?
Okay, so.
Where that red line.
Yeah. Go ahead. He was out here with me all day.
Here's coming in.
Okay, yeah.
And so like that, I think one of the rock walls comes like right here.
Yeah.
That was very close.
Yeah, I almost put my prop in jeopardy.
Yeah.
So part of this issue, at least in my mind, is to establish, if we can, the amount of cause attributable to the Deschutes River being pushed into the lake. So if there's any traceable means of doing that, starting with where the Deschutes River was routed into the lake there where it turns red.
Yeah, well, the sediment that was brought in by the Deschutes River is well distributed throughout the lake, and that's why we have that 20 feet plus of sediment. So monitoring here is not gonna be as important. This is also just where a lot more flow is coming in, so we've got more of that sediment ended up in these deeper portions, because that's when the velocity slowed down, those particles could fall out. So there's less of that happening here, because that was like at that inlet where the flows and velocities are a lot higher. So in terms of attributing it to the Deschutes diversion, we can't do that directly through the study. Would need to be, I think it's already fairly obvious that had a pretty negative ramifications in the long term for Lake Lawrence health due to this huge amount of sediment that's here that's costing millions to remove. So,
And could you do another primer on the relationship between the algae growth and our weeds? At one meeting I thought I heard that weeds are good, and then there's a relationship with the algae.
So, as we were out there today, the lake was pretty murky. So the amount of transparency, how much light could move through the lake, was minimized. And so we saw a lot of aquatic plant growth in the shallows, where the distance between the sediment and the lake surface was pretty minor, so the light could get to those plant leaves. In deeper water, it was too murky, so you don't have enough light able to reach down to, say, like a foot above the lake surface or the sediment surface, so for those aquatic plants to grow. So if we were to remove the algae, the lake is going to be a lot clearer, and so the growing habitat for those aquatic plants is going to expand and go deeper.
We get more weeds.
You get more weeds, they're deeper. At deeper.
At deeper, okay.
That said, not all weeds grow up to the very surface, and those deeper weeds may not be a problem. They offer really good fish habitat. So it depends on the type of weed. And so some, and I hate calling them weeds because they're plants and then there are the weeds. And so some plants are good and some plants are weeds. And you're doing a lot of work on weeds. And some of those weeds are native plants, like the narrow leaf pondweed,
Right.
but it still can get to a density that is very, what we call noxious, obnoxious. And especially in these nutrient-rich sediments, they can really take off. So that still is an issue to deal with.
The term we utilize in the documents that I put out is nuisance level. Because it's so thick, you can't fish, you can't boat, you can't kayak, you can't do anything across those weeds.
I have a question, and I may just be confused.
Yeah.
When you first talked about the 3 feet that you're gonna take the sample.
Yes.
And you said you're only interested in the first 10 meters, so centimeters.
Centimeters.
So, and I understand that, that's cool, so I'm thinking, oh, that's fine. But then when you said that in 94, they were saying, what, 80 or 90% of it needed to be removed, why are we not doing a deeper core sample? Because that kind of...
Yeah. So for our study, we're interested in how much phosphorus is being released from the sediment, which is just occurring in that first 10 centimeters. That phosphorus that's deeper in the sediments is not moving up.
But wouldn't it make a difference in some of your options that you would say to get rid of it? Because if you did something...
So that past study, when they have done that profile, we'll be able to rely on that, because that phosphorus concentrations in the sediment is not expected to change over time. So we don't need to replicate that study. There's been about an added foot that's added around, so we'll be looking at that added foot essentially.
Okay,
as part of the
that
study.
clarifies.
Yeah,
Okay.
I understand, yeah. So a lot of information.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for coming out.
Yeah.